Okay, welcome back, class. It's Dr. Lindner, and we're going to be looking at the neuron again, but now we're going to be looking at how do we classify neurons. And neurons can be classified functionally, and they can also be classified structurally. And that fits the basic principle of anatomy and physiology, doesn't it? Structure, function. Now, these two terms we've heard about in my opening video when I started neurology, sensory and motor. What I said was, let's say we have the brain here, and then here's the spinal cord, and we have information that can come from the outside world and come up and synapse somewhere in the brain. So it's starting out here at the limb, at the muscles, but it ascends, right? When it ascends up, that is sensory information, which is also afferent information. Information that starts in the brain, goes down the spinal cord, and goes out to your limbs and your muscles and your organs. Well, that's descending information. That's descending information. That's motor information. And that's efferent information. So sensory neurons are afferent neurons, and they're going to transport sensory information from all parts of the body, your skin, your muscles, your joints, your sense organs, all of your viscera, like your heart, your lungs, all of your organs to the CNS, to the brain and spinal cord. Where motor neurons or efferent neurons, they're going to send motor nerve impulses to muscles and glands. So it's going to go from here and go down. Now, there is a connection between the sensory and the motor, right? Sensory has to come in and there's got to be a motor command. So they have to talk to one another. The connection between the sensory and motor, that's called an interneuron or an association neuron. They're going to connect the sensory to the motor. And that's 90% of the neurons in the body are going to be interneurons or association neurons. So let's take a look and say, okay, here is a nail or a pin or a thumbtack, and it hits your hand, it hits your skin, your fingertip or something. You go, ouch. Well, how do you know? Well, there is a pain receptor that's in your finger to pick up that painful stimulus. Something poked your thumb, and or you touch something hot, and you want to move your arm away quickly to withdraw from that painful stimulus. So sensory information is going through this sensory neuron. Now, here, this is a cross section of the spinal cord, and I want to give you some basic anatomy of the spinal cord. If I were to divide this in half, oh, let me go back, my bad. If I were to divide this in half, everything from this point backwards is dorsal or posterior, and everything from this line this way is ventral or anterior. Okay, so far so good. Everything, see the butterfly in the middle? This butterfly, this is called gray matter. This is gray matter, and everything surrounding the gray matter is called white matter. So white matter, and all this in here is gray matter. What makes white matter white is that it's myelinated. All of this is myelinated. The butterfly, or the letter H in the middle, is gray matter. It's unmyelinated. Now, in the gray matter, these horn-like structures, they're actually called horns. Back here, these are called dorsal horns. That's a dorsal horn. Well, if that's a dorsal horn, guess what this one's called? This is called a ventral horn. You have dorsal horn and ventral horn. So this sensory information is coming in and is going to synapse where? At this dorsal horn. And then there's some processing of that information, or should I say a relay of that sensory information to a motor neuron. So what is it that connects the sensory neuron to the motor neuron? Well, that's this one here, called an interneuron or association neuron. So this one right here in the middle, connecting the sensory to the motor, that's your interneuron. That's the relay man in the relay race. So the painful input comes into the dorsal horn. The sensory input is processed through the association neuron or the interneuron, and it relays it to the motor neuron, which goes to the muscle and makes your biceps or your muscle contract. Now, you see this thing right here? That lollipop stick that's coming off of this sensory neuron, that's called a dorsal root ganglia. Whoa, ganglia. Dr. Linder mentioned that one in a previous video. What's a ganglia? A ganglia is a group of nerve cell bodies located in the PNS. Well, the CNS is brain and spinal cord. PNS is everything outside of the brain, outside of the spinal cord. And this right here is off the spinal cord. So this is a dorsal root ganglia. The dorsal root ganglia is off that sensory neuron. And because there's a ganglia there, this dorsal root, the sensory neuron, is also known as a dorsal root. So the dorsal root ganglia is off the dorsal root. It's dorsal, it's in the back. Because this is enlarged, this dorsal root is much thicker than the ventral root. The ventral root is thinner, but this has that swollen nodule due to the dorsal root ganglia. Pay attention to that dorsal root ganglia. That structure looks like this, like a lollipop stick, right? That's going to come to haunt us in about a second when I talk about structural classification of neurons. So sensory neuron, motor neuron, interneuron, or association neuron. Dorsal horns, ventral horns. All the sensory information comes in through the dorsal part or the back part into the dorsal horn, and all the motor information starts at the anterior horn, aka ventral horn. In fact, when a virus attacks this, polio. Polio is a virus that attacks the cells of the ventral or anterior horn, which means all the motor neurons become dysfunctional and you have no usage of your muscles. That's polio. That virus attacks the ventral horns. Now, we did functional classification. Here's structural classification. Structurally, we have a multipolar, bipolar, or unipolar neuron. The most common is this one here. That is the multipolar, where you have several dendrites with one axon. This is the classic one. This is what we use to kind of teach the parts of a neuron. We typically use a multipolar neuron to show the dendrites and the cell body and the axon and the Schwann cells and the node of Ranvier and the myelin and the axon terminals, right? That's your classic. Bipolar neuron, these are found in the eye, the retina, the ear, and sense of smell for olfaction. This is where we have one dendrite coming off the cell body, compared to multiple dendrites, right? There's only one extension coming off of it, one dendrite, and we have one axon. One main dendrite, one axon. Those are bipolar. They're found in the retina, the inner ear, and the nose, olfactory. Now, unipolar starts out like this. It starts out like this bipolar, but what happens is this cell body right here pinches off. When the cell body pinches off and pinches away, this is what it becomes. It becomes a unipolar. Now, if I take this and we look at this with our head tilted, or we turn this horizontally, what does that look like? That looks like this, the DRG, the dorsal root ganglia. So the classical unipolar, they're always sensory neurons, and the classical example of a unipolar is the dorsal root ganglia, the DRG. So this right here, look, this is the cell body, many dendrites coming off of it with a cell body, with an axon. That's your multipolar neuron. Now, the association neurons or the interneurons, these are named after the histologist that first described them, or they're also named by their appearance. So, Purkinje is a histologist. These are found throughout the brain, especially the cerebellum. And pyramidal, because this looks like a pyramid, pyramidal cells. Those are typically the interneurons or the association neurons. Good place to take a break. When we come back, I will now get into the neuroglial cells now that we've finished the neuron.